overlooked narratives from African American history that remain absent from typical school textbooks. By 1898, Wilmington, North Carolina, was the largest city in the state. It was a majority black city with a thriving economy, a growing black middle class, a functioning biracial government. Black residents held elected offices, ran businesses, and participated fully in civic life. The Fusionist coalition, made up of Republicans and populists, had managed to build a working multiracial democracy in the years following Reconstruction. Wilmington was its clearest example. Black professionals worked as doctors, lawyers, and journalists. The city had black aldermen, a black police chief, and a black-owned daily newspaper called the Daily Record. It was, by the standards of the post-Civil War South, an extraordinary place. The success of Wilmington's integrated governance system attracted national attention. Northern investors saw economic opportunity in the city's stability and growth. Black entrepreneurs accumulated wealth and property at rates that were unusual for the era. The black middle class in Wilmington was proportionally larger than in most other southern cities. Families of color owned homes in desirable neighborhoods. Black churches and fraternal organizations flourished. There were black schools, theaters, and social clubs that served the community's cultural and educational needs. The city's racial cooperation, while imperfect and fragile, demonstrated that multiracial civic participation was achievable. This visibility, however, would prove dangerous, but that success made it a target. North Carolina's Democratic Party, led by party chairman Furnifold Simmons, launched what they openly called a white supremacy campaign in 1897, specifically designed to drive fusionist politicians out of office before the 1898 elections. They used newspapers to spread propaganda, hired speakers to travel across the state delivering speeches about the dangers of black political power, organized armed militias known as Red Shirts to intimidate black voters. A group called the Secret Nine formed in Wilmington itself, made up of the city's most prominent white businessmen. They began planning what to do if Democrats couldn't win through the ballot box. The Secret Nine held regular meetings in private homes and offices throughout the city. They discussed strategies for removing the elected government and establishing white democratic control. These were not idle conversations. The conspirators drew up lists of officials who would need to be replaced. They identified which black leaders posed the greatest threat to their vision of white supremacy. They prepared contingency plans for armed action. The group understood that the election alone might not deliver the outcome they desired, so they prepared for violence as a backup strategy. Their deliberations were methodical and calculated, indicating this was not a spontaneous outbreak but a premeditated operation. The editorial that became the pretext for the violence was published in August 1898 by Alexander Manley, the 32-year-old editor of the Daily Record. A white politician named Rebecca Felton had given a speech suggesting that black men posed a threat to white women in rural areas. Manley responded directly, arguing in print that some relationships between black men and white women were consensual. That editorial was reprinted and distributed across the state by the White Supremacy Campaign. That used it to inflame white voters for months. On November 8, 1898, red shirts appeared at polling places across New Hanover County. African Americans were threatened and turned away from the polls. Democratic election officers manipulated vote counts. Democrats swept the county and won the state house. Boo. Tea for the Secret Nine and their allies winning the election wasn't enough. Wilmington's city government, which had been elected the previous year and still had time left in its term, remained in place. Alfred Moore Waddell, a former Confederate officer and former congressman, addressed a meeting of more than 1,000 white men on election eve and told them exactly what he expected. He said if they found black men trying to vote, they should tell them to leave. If they refused, to shoot them down in their tracks. 2 days after the election, on November 10th, 1898. Waddell led a mob to the Daily Record's offices and burned the building to the ground. The destruction of the Daily Record was symbolic and practical. It eliminated the voice that had challenged the white supremacy narrative. It destroyed equipment, printing plates, and records. But more importantly, it served as the signal for broader violence to commence. The burning of the newspaper building was the opening act of a coordinated assault on black political and economic power. Within hours, armed mobs gathered throughout the city. The mob that torched the newspaper had grown in size and determination. After torching the newspaper, the mob moved through Wilmington's black neighborhoods, shooting people in the streets. By the end of the day, as many as 60 black residents had been killed, though some accounts suggest the number was higher. The coroner's official count at the time was 14, but the 2006 State Commission report settled on 60 as the most defensible estimate. All of the confirmed victims were black. The violence was not random. Specific black leaders and successful business owners were targeted. Some were killed in their homes. Others were shot while attempting to flee the city. White mobs blocked escape routes to prevent black residents from leaving. The violence continued sporadically for days after the initial outbreak. Meanwhile, Waddell and other coup organizers forced the elected mayor and members of the city council to resign at gunpoint. Waddell then installed himself as mayor. The police chief was replaced. Aldermen were removed and substituted with men the conspirators had already chosen. What happened in Wilmington on November 10, 1898, was not a riot. It was a coup d'etat, the only successful one ever carried out on American soil. An elected municipal government was violently overthrown and replaced by men who had not won the offices they seized. Around 2,100 black residents fled the city in the weeks that followed. Black businesses closed. Black professionals who had spent years building their careers left and never returned. The infrastructure of black civic life that had existed in Wilmington was dismantled almost overnight. The legal consequences for the perpetrators were non-existent. No one was arrested, no one was charged, no one stood trial. In 1899, George Roundtree, an attorney who had advised the coup's organizers, helped draft the so-called grandfather clause for the state legislature. That effectively stripped most black men of the right to vote by requiring literacy as a condition, while exempting anyone whose grandfather had voted. That clause remained state law until 1915. Democrats went on to pass North Carolina's first formal racial segregation laws, requiring separate seating on trains and steamboats and even mandating separate Bibles for use in courtrooms when witnesses were sworn in. Democrats controlled North Carolina state government for the next 70 years. The 1898 coup became a model for other places across the South that sought to implement Jim Crow systems of racial control. Atlanta saw a massacre in 1906. Tulsa burned in 1921. Rosewood was destroyed in 1923. But Wilmington came first. For most of the century that followed, what happened there was described in textbooks and official state records not as a coup or a massacre, but as a race riot. A term that implied black residents had somehow been responsible for the violence used against them. The North Carolina General Assembly authorized a commission to study the events in 2000. Its final report, released in 2006, ran to nearly 500 pages. The report confirmed the premeditated nature of the coup, documented the organized campaign of propaganda and voter suppression that preceded it, placed the blame on the white supremacist leadership that had planned and executed the takeover. Schools and parks in Wilmington that had been named after men who directed the violence were eventually renamed. Community groups began the work of identifying the black residents who were killed, researching their names and their histories, trying to recover what had been erased. One of those killed was never publicly identified until researchers began going through death records and newspaper archives. More than a century later,